Hello, class, and welcome to your Chapter 12 lecture. Today we're going to be discussing hallucinogens. So the learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to explain why hallucinogens became so popular during the 1960s, describe how hallucinogens alter the senses, describe why some psychotherapists believe MDMA and other hallucinogens may be beneficial and how public approval of marijuana will likely affect this movement, explain the reasons for ecstasy's recent fluctuations in patterns of use, explain how hallucinogens differ from other commonly abused drugs, describe the effects environment and personality have on individuals' response to hallucinogens, explain club drugs and problems associated with their use, characterize how PCP differs from other hallucinogens and why it is so dangerous, explain the similarities between PCP and ketamine, and lastly, to describe the recreational and legal status of salvia divinorum. So by way of introduction, psychedelic comes from the Greek root meaning of mind revealing. So hallucinogens are substances that alter sensory processing in the brain, causing perceptual disturbances, changes in thought processing, and depersonalization. Psychedelics are substances that either expand or heighten one's perceptions and consciousness. So these drugs can cause feelings of euphoria, even agitation and aggression in some. Typically, the treatment for this has been to place the individual into a quiet, non-threatening environment so that they can decompress because their senses and perceptions are so heightened from the drug. There have also been the need for chemical and physical restraints if the person becomes too aggressive or agitated, and even leading up to hospitalizations. So let's take a look at the history of hallucinogen use. So historically, hallucinogens have been viewed either as holy or sacred. So holy and sacred, or as the person being controlled by the devil. That's how they've viewed the use of hallucinogens based on how the person acts under the drug. So before the 1960s, psychedelic substances were legally available. Medical professionals actually supported their use to help a person get in touch with themselves and to even achieve peaceful inner serenity. They have been used by shamans, medicine men, priests, and even Native Americans for religious and spiritual experiences. Though, because of a psychosis-like schizophrenia that results from the widespread use, we use this term psychotomimetic, which was coined to describe these compounds, and this term simply means psychosis mimicking. So individuals, because of the widespread use of hallucinogens, were starting to experience this psychosis-like schizophrenia. By the mid-1960s, access was beginning to be restricted on these drugs, and laws against their distribution were enacted. Historically, though, the Native American Church has actually used peyote from the peyote cactus in a lot of their ceremonies. Congress did legislate against its use in 1965, but did give room for allowance for religious use of the psychedelic plants, specifically by the Native American Church. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 was another attempt by Congress to allow the members of the Native American Church access to peyote based on constitutional guarantees of their religious freedom, since this drug was used in their ceremonies. And then an amendment in 1994 specifically protected the use of peyote in Native American church ceremonies. So the government even recognized that there were some situations and circumstances where they still needed to make an allowance for the use of this drug. And then Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary is a different case. So he began a religion called the League of Spiritual Discovery, and he wrote a manual for it called The Psychedelic Experience in an attempt to be able to use psychedelics under the right to religious freedom. Most members of the so-called religion, though, use it as a front simply to gain access to these illegal drugs. Timothy Leary was actually fired from Harvard in 1963 for his questionable practices in experimenting with psychedelic drugs. And in 1969, he was convicted of possession of marijuana and LSD and was committed to 20 years in prison. So those are two different sides of the spectrum you can see where we're protecting peyote for the Native American church, but the government also recognized that you can't simply make up a church just so that you can gain illegal access to these drugs. Looking at the nature of hallucinogens, there is no agreement of what constitutes a hallucinogenic agent. A common feature, though, is their ability to alter one's perception, thoughts, and feelings. So psychedelic, psychotogenic, or psychotomimetic influence complex inner workings of the human mind. And in high doses, anticholinergics, cocaine, amphetamines, and steroids can also cause hallucinations in an individual. Psychotogenics simply means a substance that initiates psychotic behavior. So here you can see I pulled out just a few pictures of a woman who took a psychedelic drug and then drew herself over the course of, I believe it was 9 hours. So if you Google this, you can actually find she drew herself about every 45 minutes to an hour. But you can see how her perceptions of herself and her art even changed as she was taking the drug. Now, what are the different stages of sensory and psychological effects that a psychedelic agent would have? Well, the first is a heightened or exaggerated senses. So sensation caused by LSD-like hallucinogens is synesthesia, or a crossover phenomenon between the senses. Sound may have visual dimensions, and you may hear colors or see sounds, so their paths cross. Typically, you should not be able to hear a color or see a sound. The second is having a loss of control. So this is either a pleasant or a bad trip. So you can experience very pleasant feelings or very negative ones. And a bad trip can actually include recollections of hidden fears or suppressed anxieties. Flashbacks are another concern when taking these drugs. So these are also known as a hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, where frightening experiences occur at later times, even though the individual has not taken the drug again. So essentially, you could have a bad trip on the drug, days, weeks, months later, have that same experience because of the results of taking the drug the first time, even though you haven't taken it again, which is scary to think about. The third would be self-reflection. So being more aware of your thoughts and feelings that are hidden beneath the surface, or those feelings and thoughts that have been forgotten or repressed. So it essentially makes the unconscious conscious. And for some, that may sound like a great feeling or idea to think about. For others who may have worked very hard to suppress negative emotions and negative experiences in their life, you may not want to bring those back to the surface. The FDA has also not approved this drug for any psychiatric use, though there are now some clinical trials going on with MDMA specifically and the treatment of PTSD, which we'll talk about a little more later. The fourth is then a loss of identity and a sense of cosmic merging. So these people may experience mystical and spiritual aspects from taking the drug. So for individuals who have very rigid, high-ordered personalities, when they take hallucinogens, they may actually experience extreme panic and anxiety because you're not used to letting yourself let go, essentially. And some people have sadly committed suicide and even homicide while taking these hallucinogenic drugs. So how does this drug act on the body? Well, there are multiple mechanisms that are likely responsible for the actions of hallucinogens. It has been suggested that hallucinogens act at the central nervous system site to exert psychedelic effects, though there are multiple mechanisms that could be possible. So the possible CNS sites of action can include the spinal cord to the cortex of the brain, the neurotransmitter serotonin. So it affects the neurotransmitter serotonin most likely because of its psychedelic properties. norepinephrine. It can also act on dopamine and acetylcholine. So it acts on numerous sites within the body, which may be why it has such a profound impact on the unconscious. We have a few different types of hallucinogenic agents that we're going to go through. We have traditional or LSD types, phenylethylamine, and anticholinergic or other. So let's first start with traditional or LSD type drugs. So our traditional hallucinogens. These drugs are the basis of comparison for all other types of psychedelic agents. So the administration of LSD for clinical objectives hasn't been approved for general use, mostly because it has limited proven success in treating conditions because of legal restrictions and also because of the difficulty in obtaining the drug in a pure fashion. Also, there's adverse reactions to the drug, and it has a rapid tolerance buildup. So these are reasons why typically administration of LSD for clinical trials hasn't been approved. So if we take a look first at lysergic acid diethylamide, this has been tried in treating alcoholism, autism, even paranoia, schizophrenia, depression, and other mental and emotional disorders. Again, there is current research into treating depression as well as compulsive disorders and chronic pain using LSD. And non-medical uses of LSD did peak in the 1960s, and we had a second resurgence in the early 1990s. The second resurgence of non-medical use was due to a decline in the perceived dangers and an increase in peer approval of taking hallucinogenic type drugs. Your book talks about what the typical LSD user may look like. This typically includes someone who is white, a college or high school student, coming from the middle class, and they will typically consider themselves a risk taker. Now, looking at early human research. So the CIA and the US Army actually tested LSD type hallucinogens on human subjects in the 1950s. Frank Olson was a biochemist who actually killed himself due to a severe psychotic episode in 1953 after he was given a drink that was laced with LSD. So it was not until 1976 that the extent of these studies that were being conducted were revealed, and we found that nearly 585 soldiers and 900 civilians were given LSD in very poorly organized experiments. In 1987, a New York judge actually awarded $700,000 to a family of mental health patient who had killed himself after being given LSD without being explained the nature of the drug or the effects that it could have on him. We also need to look at the genetic damage and birth defects that can result from LSD type hallucinogens. So while there is no chromosomal damage that has been shown in infants or children when the mother uses LSD, street LSD has been linked to higher rates of spontaneous abortions as well as malformed infants. So this could be the result of the contaminants that are in the LSD when you're buying them off the street, not necessarily the hallucinogen pure LSD itself. Again, remember that you don't know what you're getting when you're buying drugs off the street. They could be cutting those drugs with a number of chemicals and contaminants. So how is LSD synthesized and administered? So LSD is a complex molecule that requires very sophisticated chemistry and a trained chemist to be able to produce it in pure forms. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It has been sold in tablets, capsules, thin squares of gelatin, and even having the liquid dissolved on blotter paper and dried, and then one can consume the blotter paper. Just 1 gram of LSD can equal 10,000 doses and can range in cost anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000. So it's a very profitable career choice if one would choose to sell LSD. However, It requires such, again, a sophisticated chemistry and trained chemists to be able to even produce pure LSD that not many people would be able to produce this. So what are the physiological effects that this has on an individual? Well, the effects typically will begin within 30 to 90 minutes after the person ingests the drug, and these effects can last up to 12 hours. Microdosing is a new approach to using hallucinogens. So a common dose today is about 10 to 30 micrograms versus a typical dose in the 1960s, which was 150 to 300 micrograms. So in microdosing, the individual will consume small quantities every 4 days, roughly 4 days, for subtle improvements in their mood, productivity, creativity, enhanced focus, as well as decreased reactivity. There have, however, been no peer-reviewed studies on the benefits of microdosing or the effects of microdosing. We only have anecdotal stories from those who have tried it. Additionally, the brain typically receives 1% of the total dose, and this is concentrated in the hypothalamus, the limbic system, as well as your auditory and visual reflexes, which again is how you get those types of side effects because it is reaching the brain. This drug also activates the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. This can cause a rise in your body temperature, your heart rate, blood pressure, and even cause dilated pupils. It can also cause an increase in salivation and nausea in the parasympathetic nervous system. Tolerance to LSD does build quite quickly when doses are repeated. However, that will wear off in a few days of cessation. Typically, LSD has no withdrawal symptoms and no physical dependence, which is what makes it so appealing to certain individuals. There is, however, some psychological dependence for those who really like those euphoric effects that they get, or who like to bring out their unconscious or creativity, which we'll cover in our next slide here. So the behavioral effects of LSD. When we look at creativity and insight, users typically believe that they're more creative and have a deeper insight than is actually demonstrated. So individuals will report being more creative, but those acts are hindered by the motor impairments that come along with consuming the drug. So the artwork and creativity that comes out of individuals when they're under the influence of LSD is also described to be as reminiscent of schizophrenic art. So again, we're going back to how the effects of LSD can also mimic schizophrenia. And these individuals typically believe that they have more insight and provide better answers to life's questions, but that's not demonstrated when they're tested. So what it comes down to is the individual may feel that they're super creative, that they're very intelligent while they're taking the drug, but when they actually are asked to demonstrate that, it doesn't follow through in their demonstration. When we look at some of the adverse psychedelic effects that can occur, this is one's environment and their personality can both affect the experience that a user is going to have to the hallucinogen. So the first is that they can have a psychotic adverse reaction, which is an intense, nightmarish experience. The person may have a complete loss of emotional control, experience paranoid delusions, hallucinations, panic attacks, psychosis, and catatonic seizures, which if you've never experienced panic attacks or don't know someone who has, essentially your body is telling yourself that you're sick and nauseous, and it's a state of intense anxiety. My mother and my sister both suffer from this, so I can speak from experience that it is not something pleasant that I would wish on anyone, or that anyone would want to willingly experience. The second is a non-psychotic adverse reaction. So this is just varying degrees of having tension, anxiety, fear, depression, and even despair. So these are some of the adverse psychedelic effects that can come along with using LSD. When we talk about perceptual effects, the drug typically causes altered perceptions or unusual illusions. So you may see shifting geometric patterns being mixed with intense color perceptions. Stationary objects may move while they're not actually moving. And you may even have a distorted sense of time, whether that means time is going very fast or time is going very slow. You're unable to tell time accurately. And finally, we'll discuss flashbacks. So we briefly touched on this a little bit ago. So flashbacks can come on unexpectedly, and they can be triggered either by a physical or a psychological stress or use of another drug. So a body trip is going to be described as the reoccurrence of an unpleasant physical sensation. A bad mind trip is the recurrence of a distressing thought or emotion. And then one may experience a flashback of an altered visual perception. So this is the most frequent type of recurrence that happens, and it consists of seeing either dots, flashes, trails of light, halos, even false motion in the peripheral field. So on your sides, when you're looking straight, you may see that happening to the side of you when it's not actually occurring. Or you can have other types of sensations that are visual. So let's shift gears now and talk about mescaline or peyote, which again was used by the Native Americans. So it also goes by the name of Big Chief, Blue Caps, Buttons, Cactus, Moon, and San Pedro. Those are some of the street names for it. About 1 in 30 psychoactive chemicals are found in the peyote cactus. It has been used for long-term religious uses, but it does not have significant psychological effects and doesn't cause deficits in cognitive performance in Native Americans who have been using this for a number of years. Though when we look at psychological effects of peyote, 300 to 600 milligrams can produce visual hallucinations, dilated pupils, can increase one's body temperature, cause anxiety, even an alteration of your body image, so it can distort the way you view yourself, the way you view time. Vomiting can occur, and muscular relaxation. The peyote, however, is 1,000 to 3,000 times less potent than LSD. So this is one of the main reasons why you're not seeing those significant psychological and cognitive performance deficits in Native Americans that have been using it, because it is not equivalent to an LSD, and it is natural. When we look at mechanisms of action, they can take effect within 30 minutes to 2 hours and last as long as 9 to 12 hours. The peyote cactus does alter serotonin systems, and that's where it acts. Now, looking at psilocybin, the principal source is from the Psilocybe mexicanum mushrooms. It was first used by early natives of Central America well over 2,000 years ago. The Aztecs actually used mushrooms for ceremonial rites. The active ingredients were extracted and synthesized by a man named Albert Hofmann. So when it's ingested orally, it can be ingested either fresh or dried. So the mushroom will either be fresh or dried. And dried contains between 0.2 and 0.5% psilocybin. It has been reported to be helpful in the treatment of depression, and notes that it stimulates the autonomic nervous system, it can dilate pupils, and increases your body temperature. When a person takes up to 4 milligrams, it can cause pleasant experiences, relaxation, and some body sensations, though when taken at higher doses, this can cause perceptual and body image changes along with hallucinations. There is no physical dependence, though, on psilocybin. Now, tryptamines. These actually exist naturally in herbs, fungi, and animals, though many are labeled as a Schedule I drug. So DMT is the first one we're going to talk about, And this is a short-acting hallucinogen that is found in the seeds of certain leguminous trees. It also occurs naturally in the body or can be synthetically prepared. This has been coined the businessman's lunch break because the effects occur rapidly and they only last less than 1 hour typically. So you can take the drug, experience its effects, and be back to work within your hour lunch break. If it is inhaled and it does not cause physical dependence, similar to the other drugs we spoke about. Foxy, as it has been called, is a Schedule I rave and club drug, and this one is consumed orally or can be smoked. And nutmeg actually contains 5 to 15% of myristica oil, and this actually blocks the release of serotonin. So it can cause drowsiness, a stupor, delirium, and sleep, or one of those unpleasant trips that we spoke about. At very high doses, so about 2 tablespoons would be a high dose, it can actually be intoxicating. The next one we'll cover now is phenylethylamine hallucinogens. So these are chemically related to amphetamines, and the hallucinogenic effects occur by releasing serotonin. It is a CNS stimulant that affects by releasing the dopamine in your brain, and it is typically used at raves or clubs. So when we look at DOM, D-O-M, the basic structure is amphetamine, but it's actually a powerful hallucinogenic effect on the body. The effects are actually similar to those that are caused by taking a combination of an amphetamine and LSD. It is not addicting, but a tolerance can be built with multiple exposures to the drug. When we look at MDMA, first we're going to talk about MDA, which has also been called the love drug. MDA was first synthesized in 1910, and it is structurally related to mescaline and amphetamine. It has been used as an anorexiant as well as a mood elevator because it causes a release of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which are your good feelings. In the past, it has actually been used as an adjunct to psychotherapy. So in addition to a person receiving psychotherapy, they may be prescribed MDMA or MDA, excuse me. It causes an intensification of feelings, increased perceptions of self-insight, and even a heightened empathy. It can also cause an increased sense of aesthetic enjoyment, as well as heightened tactile sensations from its stimulant effect. So users sometimes report that they feel a sensual body high. MDMA currently is a Schedule I drug. And then we look at MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy or Molly. So this is a modification of MDA, and it has more psychedelic and less stimulant activities. It was synthesized in 1912, actually as a drug meant to suppress one's appetite. It was found, however, though, that it causes euphoria, increased energy, increased sensitivity to touch, as well as lowered inhibitions. It can also intensify emotional feelings without having the sensory distortions, and it increases empathy or awareness of a user's body. So some have considered this an aphrodisiac type drug. The high can last from just a few minutes to hours. In recreational doses, it causes dilated pupils, dry mouth and throat, and sometimes clenching or grinding of the teeth. And at high doses, it can cause psychosis and even paranoia. So death from taking MDMA can actually be caused by hypothermia, so then an elevated body temperature, or an instability of the autonomic nervous system. There can be also underlying cardiovascular problems the person has, or kidney failure. So this is typically why death would occur from taking high doses of MDMA. It does have long-term damage to the serotonin neurons. It can impair one's memory and provide a diminished ability to process information, as well as heightened impulsivity. So, ecstasy was actually popularized in the media in the 1980s for its euphoric effects, as well as the potential therapeutic value that it had. It also lacked serious side effects. So, for some of these reasons, it is currently being studied for use in those who suffer from PTSD. Its popularity peaked in 2003 when it was being used annually by roughly 3.6% of high school seniors. Though, because of reports of MDMA's neurotoxicity and the persistent negative side effects that users were experiencing, use of the drug has begun to decrease dramatically. And in 2018, it was only being used by 0.5% of high school seniors. So we have seen use decrease over time. Now, if we look at anticholinergic hallucinogens, these are those that are naturally occurring alkaloids substances present in plants and herbs. These types of hallucinogens block some acetylcholine receptors, and they've been used as cold symptom remedies for the drying effect that it has, as well as its ability to block the production of mucus. So this drug has been mentioned in folklore as being added to potions when we are talking about Jimson weed. It is a wild weed that grows in most parts of the United States, and it's a free high and easy to find. So that's why people have used it. Though it can cause hallucinations, confusion, dilated pupils, and even a rapid heartbeat. Historically, it was used to actually eliminate inconvenient people or used in religious ceremonies. At low doses, it can cause drowsiness, but at higher doses, you can have symptoms similar to psychosis, being characterized by delirium, a loss of attention, mental confusion, sleepiness, and even hallucinations. While at high doses, you can experience paralysis of the respiratory system, which can cause death. So those don't sound like pleasant effects from anticholinergic hallucinogens. And finally, we'll end with other hallucinogens for this section. So we have 4 agents here that don't actually conveniently fit into the principal categories of hallucinogens. So we have phenylcylidine, or PCP as we'll refer to it, ketamine, dextromethorphan, and marijuana. So we're going to go through each of these 4. First, we'll start with PCP. PCP has been called angel dust, butt naked, purple rain, yellow fever, and even zombie. It was actually discontinued for human use due to its schizophrenia-like symptoms. While it is legally available as an anesthetic for animals, it's been banned from most vet practices since 1985. PCP has been laced in marijuana, tobacco, and with cocaine, and it can be ingested either orally, it can be smoked, sniffed, or even injected. So it is a Schedule II drug, and it is the most dangerous hallucinogen. It was developed in the late 1950s as an intravenous anesthetic, which is why it is legally available still as an anesthetic for animals. And it's also been known as a wet weed. So when we look at some of the physiological effects, it can cause stimulation, depression, have anesthesia type effects, as well as an analgesia. It affects the central nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the cardiovascular systems. The way it affects the body psychologically is having a sense of power, strength, or invulnerability while taking the drug. So some individuals have equated this to having godlike feelings because it alters your subjective feelings. You're going to have a heightened sensitivity to outside stimuli, stimulation, and even an elevated mood, and a disassociation from your surroundings, as well as perceptual distortions, paranoia, and unpredictable violent behavior and auditory hallucinations. My mom actually worked as a loss prevention manager for a number of years, and she once told me about a man who was high on PCP, And it took about 6 or 7 individuals to actually hold this man down because he was so violent and so just disassociated from his surroundings. And he had this unhuman like strength. So we also have here medical management. So it's important to talk about medical management of PCP because a chronic user can actually develop a tolerance. They can develop long-term difficulties in their speech, memory, and thinking that can persist for 6 to 12 months. So we want to make sure that we're giving those who need it proper medical management. So in this case, individuals should be isolated from any external stimuli, and some have even needed to be given Valium for sedation because of their out of control and erratic behaviors. Next, we'll touch on ketamine or Special K. This is known as a club drug and has also been abused as a date rape drug. Recent research shows that it's promising for treatment for depression because it rapidly reduces the impulse to commit suicide. So most users who use ketamine are polydrug users, and chronic abuse can actually lead to a loss of cognitive functioning as well as deteriorating sense of well-being. It was originally developed as an anesthetic, similar to PCP, and it's been described as giving a weightlessness, an out-of-body, or near-death experiences. But again, it has been showing promise in the use of an antidepressant. Dextromethorphan. So this is actually used in over-the-counter cough medicines, and it is a mild stimulant it can range from being either a mild stimulant to causing complete disassociation. It can also cause confusion, nervousness, irritability, numbness, distortion, and stomach pains. In high quantities, it can have hallucinogenic effects. Now, roboing, which is popular among teenagers, is simply known as the abuse of dextromethorphan. So teens may drink a whole bottle of cough medicine to hopefully get those hallucinogenic effects. But they should be concerned that they may start experiencing that confusion, nervousness, irritability, all of those other negative adverse effects and reactions. So now we'll discuss marijuana. So it has stimulant, depressant, or hallucinogenic effects. It can cause a loss of contact with reality, as well as distorted emotions and sensory perception. This mixture of actions is probably related to the fact that cannabinoid receptors are found in parts of the brain related to functions such as pleasure, memory, cognitive function, one's concentration, coordination, as well as sensory, space, and time perceptions. It has been used, though, in treatment of chronic pain, weight loss, and nausea in people with cancer, AIDS, neurological disorders, PTSD, and even anxiety. It recently now has also been approved in some states for medical and recreational use, which you can take a look at the map to the right here to see which states have legalized marijuana just for medical use or for recreational use or both. So the last type we're going to talk about is Salvia divinorum. So this is a Mexican herb that is actually illegal in many states, but it's not federally outlawed. This drug alters one's consciousness, though some research suggests that the drug may be useful in treating depression and stress management and even drug addiction. Typically, this herb is either smoked, chewed, crushed, or mixed into drinks, and it can cause intense hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and even short-term memory loss. But again, it has been used in some research suggesting that it could be used to treat some of these ailments. In sum, hallucinogens became so popular during the 1960s because they had support from medical professionals for their ability to help a person get in touch with themselves and to achieve a peaceful inner serenity. Hallucinogens can cause heightened and exaggerated sensations and altered perceptions. Some psychotherapists believe that MDMA and other hallucinogens may be beneficial because of their ability to lower defense mechanisms and reduce inhibitions. The public approval of marijuana for medical and recreational use may actually open the doorway for hallucinogens to follow suit. Ecstasy was actually popularized in the media in the 1980s for its euphoric effects, potential therapeutic value, and lack of serious side effects. This popularity peaked in 2003 as a rave or club drug, but has recently declined due to reports of neurotoxicity, as well as persistent negative side effects. Hallucinogens typically have no withdrawal effects and do not cause physical dependence. One's environment as well as personality are going to have an effect on the experience a user has to a hallucinogen. Club drugs cause euphoria, increased energy, as well as sensitivity to touch, lowered inhibitions, intensified emotional experiences without giving those sensory distortions, though, that other LSD type hallucinogens give. And it has also been described as acting as an aphrodisiac. However, it has often been used as a date rape drug because it is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. PCP differs from the other hallucinogens as its psychological effects include a sense of power, strength, invulnerability, as well as the unpredictable violent behavior and auditory hallucinations that come along. Both PCP and ketamine were originally developed as anesthetics and have similar effects, though ketamine is actually more rapid and less potent. And finally, Salvia divinorum is used recreationally for its hallucinogenic properties, but it is not frequently abused because of its unpleasant side effects. And again, as it is currently illegal in some states, the federal government has not yet outlawed it. So that was your Chapter 12 lecture on hallucinogens. I hope you all have a fabulous week, and please reach out with any questions.